Bom dia a todos mais uma vez. Meu nome é Jorge Zubelli e eu estou aqui no IMPA, num ciclo de palestras que organizamos a respeito do tópico de matemática e criminologia, matemática no sentido de estatística, de modelagem matemática, de análise e outros tópicos. É um evento, num certo sentido, bastante multidisciplinar. É realmente uma honra ter conosco agora o professor Eduardo Massad, professor da EMAp, da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, um renomado especialista na área de epidemiologia, com trabalhos reconhecidos por todo o mundo. O professor Eduardo Massad vem se interessando pelo tópico de criminologia nos últimos anos, e o que ele vai descrever hoje é extremamente importante, vai agregar um novo aspecto para o que foi discutido antes. Então, na primeira palestra, como vocês podem ver, como vocês viram, foi uma discussão do ponto de vista estatístico, com estatística espacial, geoespacial, com análise temporal. Nessa palestra que o professor Eduardo Massad vai proferir, ele vai analisar, então, os aspectos de modelagem via sistemas dinâmicos da criminalidade. Então, professor Massad, muito obrigado. Vamos passar para inglês. It's my pleasure to have here Professor Eduardo Massad. Thank you very much for your presence here.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor. I'm very happy to be here again, once again. And perhaps I should start by stating why my talk differs from my previous Professor Matteo. He dig deeper in data and predictions, but essentially focus on street crime. And my talk has no data whatsoever. Perhaps I should apologize for that, but it's purely theoretical work. But my attempt is to dig deeper in criminal behavior, and I will try to model a criminal career and taking into account organized crime. And thank you, Max, for the question. I will try to address organized crime in the sense that I will try to apply the kind of models that we have been using for trying to explain, understand, and predict infectious disease through a sort of contagious criminality. So how one group of people can contaminate another group of people and bring them into a criminal career. But I would like to start with some psychological aspects of criminality. And I will start to deconstruct one wrong view of this dichotomy between good and evil, right? But every time that we think on or we speak on evil, what comes to mind is him, the guy. This is the paradigm of the bad guy, right? And when we think about goodness, what comes into mind is her, the paradigm of goodness, isn't it? So we tend to think or divide people between these two extremes, the bad guy and the good guys, right? But we have to consider that even the bad guy has his moment of tenderness. Hitler liked dogs. He liked to tell bedtime stories to Goebbels' kids. And of course, he was a bad guy. Of course, he was a bad guy. But in contrast, the good girl, Mother Teresa, she, in the 90s, she lobbied in Ireland against the law for divorce. But some few years later, she was there congratulating her friend for getting rid for unhappy marriage. The message is that people are not entirely bad or entirely good. We have, shades of gray, and more than 50, by the way. And all of us travel, we commute in this spectrum, right? Depends on the circumstance. Of course, we have personality traits that puts people on this side of the spectrum and people on this side. But we commute along this spectrum, depending on the circumstance. The message is, every one of us, we are all able of perpetrating the worst of atrocity. Nobody is free of that. So there is not one essentially good girl or good boy, and there is not essentially a bad guy. Okay? Well, all of us are, in a word, susceptible to criminal behavior or to bad behavior. That's the basic assumption of the model. Okay? So people are susceptible to get into a criminal career, every one of us. Of course, some of more, some of less, depending on many factors that I will comment upon in a few minutes. Okay? All right, this is the empirical evidence of what I'm talking about. Milgram experiment is a very classic and famous experiment, right? This is the subject, okay? This is the researcher, and this, in fact, is an actor. The experiment consists in this guy asking a question for this one. Every time this got a wrong answer, he received an electric shock delivered by the volunteer, and in an increasingly fashion. So it starts with 15 volts and end with 450 volts. And even though these were sometimes, asking for stopping the experiment, and this was screaming, of course, but everything was a deception. In fact, this was an actor. There is no electrical shock, in fact. This was an experiment. But the fact is that 65% of the volunteers went up to 400 volts on that. Okay? So depending on, obedience or depending on the circumstance, everyone is able to perpetrate the worst of atrocities. This is a picture of the famous experiment on that. This is the actor screaming and asking to stop. Another one is Zimbardo's prison experiment. Philip Zimbardo, psychologist, professor of Stanford University, in 1971, he took a bunch of students and divided them into guards and prisoners. Okay? And he demanded that the guards was very rough with the prisoners. And they perpetrated so many atrocities with the other colleagues and friends sometimes that the experiment had to be stopped in that. And now it's interesting that this is the book by Philip Zimbardo. It's called The Lucifer Effect. The Lucifer Effect is exactly what I'm saying. Depending on the circumstances, everyone is possible or able to do the worst act that we can imagine. Okay, this is the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. You see where soldiers from a country that is no God-feared and well-behaved and, and did all of these horrible things with the people there. Okay. What I'm going to talk about was inspired by the book by Farrington. Farrington was a very important criminal psychologist. He worked for 40 years in the Institute of Criminology of Cambridge University, and he wrote down this book explaining criminal career. And this was the first models trying to explain a criminal career in the sense, what is the dynamic of the people going in and out of prisons. And you see, and he divided people in persisters, those who come to cycles of convictions and release from prison and new convictions, and this what he called the criminal career, and those who are desisters were convicted only once, I say, and this is based on data. He had access to very good data from many cohorts from in the UK, okay? And this is the proportion of reconviction given previous convictions. See, this is a career indeed. People went up to 20 convictions in some extreme case, right? And this is how the model divided these into two kinds of offenders, you see? And you see the appearance number in the prison system, you see. And we have two different cohorts, persisters and desisters on that, right? And this was his model. They call it the dual risk recidivism model. This is just a description of what was observed in the several cohorts that he studies in the UK from the first cohorts of the 1950s along all the life of these individuals, okay? This is how he calculated the interconviction survival time, only descriptive models on that. This is the age distribution of first conviction in the cohort. You see, people are convicted on average on 20-something here. Of course, it's a right-skewed curve. And this is the dynamical model. This is the total population in the prison system, you see. And this is the risk of getting convicted, all right? And this is interesting because by the first time, here we have something that resembles contagious process. It's not, and we will include contagious in the model. And it ends up with this kind description. This is new. Of course, everyone recognizes here Poisson distribution of conviction, okay? And that's it. This is the PDF of the offender. What is the probability density function of being convicted depending on the risk of getting convicted at the time. All right, so let's see how we can adapt all this basic framework and if we can use as a kind of metaphor from infectious disease to criminal behavior. So we have people that are susceptible to criminal career. As I mentioned, every one of us, we are susceptible to anything that may happen. And we have some people that we try to mirror organized crime. And this organized crime kind of infects susceptible outside the prison system. This is typical of our Brazilian problem on criminality. Okay? We have a huge proportion of crimes that is directed from inside the prison system. So what we are going to model now is how we can model people from inside the prison system are contaminating susceptible individuals of young age outside the prison. In the prison, we have a criminal career. And so how people get into a criminal career by being infected from the organized crime. This is the basic idea of the model, okay? This is the general model. It's deterministic. There is no data in here. And as I mentioned, the aim is try to identify which are the factors that determine one individual getting into a criminal career. What determines people starting a criminal career, in other words? Here we have susceptible individuals to a criminal career. They get into that by demographic factors. They may die. And they may be induced to a criminal career. They may be convicted with parameters that is, in a sense, is an incidence. This is what we call the force of conviction. Once in the criminal system, these convicted people maybe either die by natural causes or maybe die by being in prison. Of course, this parameter alpha here is much higher than mu, because people die inside prison, we know that, okay? People may simply desist from the criminal career. This got resistant to new convictions, in a sense. They may be released and turn into susceptible again to a new conviction, and so on and so forth. Of course, this model is too complex to be analyzed in details. What we can do, we can carry out numerical simulations on that. But what is important in that is if we decompose what we call the force of conviction, perhaps we can identify which are the factors that are determining whether a specific individual will get into a criminal career or not. So let's now go deeper into the force of offense or conviction. All right, here we have essentially two components on that. This is age dependent. Of course, the susceptibility shows a very strong age dependence on the susceptibility to criminal career. And we have here one factor that is common to everyone. Let's call it Zimbardo-Lucifer effect. Okay? Everyone is susceptible to that, independent on all the criminals around. And then we have this is contagious factors. And we may see here is the number of infectious contact per time unit, is the rate. And you see, susceptible individuals may be influenced by convicted individuals with this rate of contact and with this specific probability. But they may be infected by others susceptible outside the prison system as well, with a different probability. Of course, perhaps the contact rate could be different from these two factors of that. One stochastic bench of factors that we're not taking into account explicitly. But what is interesting here is that provided that we have this general framework, we can identify, for instance, for psychopaths, which perform about 1% of the population, this Zimbardo effect is much stronger, much higher than the contagious fact. In other words, a psychopath doesn't need anyone to convince him to start a criminal career. They has a natural propensity to that. This 1% of the general population, inside the prison system, they reach 20%. Okay? Of course, every serial killer is a psychopath, but not all psychopaths are serial killers. You have very well succeed people that can be easily be classified as psychopaths. Have, political figures, bankers, and so on, surgeons. For the remaining of the population, you see the contagious is more, the contagious factor is more important than the natural propensity to that. These are assumptions of the model, only that, okay? And you see that we can now use another metaphor for an infectious disease, which is the basic reproduction number. That is, what is the number of susceptible individuals are convinced to get into a criminal career by others per time unit, okay? But in other words, how many susceptible individuals are convinced to get into a criminal career by one single infective or criminal individuals, all right? And we can, design the equation taking into account all of the contagious factors on that, and these are the factors that remove people from the criminal career. It's very similar to the infectious disease modeling that we are used to see around. Another interesting aspect that we can identify what are the static factors. The static in the sense there is nothing we can do to change that. It's intrinsic to individuals. For instance, we have neurological constituents of the individuals. Personality profile. We don't change these. We don't change age. Here should be sex, it's not gender. I should correct this slide. I always forget to do that. It's not gender, it's sex. Prenatal history, previous convictions history, psychopathy, genetic background. These are static factors. We can do nothing whatsoever about that. This is intrinsic part of the individual's constituents. But we have dynamic factors upon which we can intervene. So if we manage to identify and quantify and see ways, we can reduce susceptibility to criminal behavior. In the long run, we can, in a sense, control criminality, at least this kind of organized criminality. The use of illicit drug, unemployment, peer influence, this is contagious factors outside the prison system, educational levels, socioeconomic levels. So every one of these dynamic factors are those which public policy should be aimed to control, to reduce. Theoretically, if we reduce the basic reproduction number of criminality below unit, this is a threshold, we control this flow of individuals getting in and out of the criminal career. Okay, so let's see how we can analyze that. That general model is very difficult to analyze, but if we simplify that, we can study, at least, for instance, do an equilibrium analysis of that. Here we have susceptible individuals. This is the low criminality model. These susceptible individuals get into the career by the first time independently of any contagious factors. So this is only the Lucifer effect in this simple model. Okay? Once inside the prison system, individual may either die or be released. Only this one can desist from the career, but this can also desist from that, give up a career. From then on, we have contagious effects taking over the process, okay? And we can analyze this, which is inside the prison system from the second conviction onwards. And what is interesting, this is just the general structure of the model. These are the variables and the parameters. And this is the equilibrium analysis. This is what things get worrying. Here we have the reproduction number, the number of individuals who are convinced by others to get into a criminal career. And we know that theoretically there is a threshold. Below unit, everything should be unstable. I mean, the non-trivial equilibrium should be unstable. However, for this kind of model, we identify what we call a backward bifurcation, in a sense that depending on the value of the betas, the number of potentially infective contacts per time unit, we have some equilibrium which are stable below the unit. That's what we call backward bifurcation. And this is very important from the dynamic point of view, but even more important from the control point of view. Even if we identify the factors upon which we could intervene to reduce the reproductive number below unit, even though we have non-trivial equilibrium which are stable. This makes controlling crime, if this contagious model is correct, is much more tough than we imagined at first, only analyzing the general model. Okay? And we see if this is a phase diagram in which we vary now the contagious from the secondarily convicted individual, reoffenders. And we see again that we have all of these, even when we have values for reproductive number below unit, we have one stable, non-trivial equilibrium here. Just another way to see the same phenomenon. Okay? This is a slightly different model in which even from the first time, individuals are infected by convicted people. Here, contagious start from the phase of the career. And again, this is similar to the previous one. Okay. This is the general model. And this, again, we see backward bifurcation, which is very worrying because, as I mentioned before, even if we identify the factors that determine that these career will get off, in the sense that people are getting in and out of the prison system, we have this backward bifurcation. In other words, we have non-trivial equilibrium even when the reproductive number is below unit. Again, we've seen a backward bifurcation in this kind of model. What we are trying to address now, these are work in progress, okay? This is a dengue-inspired model in the sense that for dengue, infectious disease caused by a virus transmitted by one mosquito, we have at least 4 types of virus, dengue 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there is a very curious phenomenon in dengue. If you are infected by one serotype of the virus, if you have a second infection by another type, the disease is much more serious than the previous one. This is called the antibody enhancement effect. Something that gets inside individuals that makes a secondary infection much worse than the first one. And there are some evidence that people who are convicted by the second time are normally convicted by a more serious crime than the first one. And that's how we try to adapt this model for this situation. Here we have susceptible individuals. These are the individuals who have been infected by serotype 1. That is, they are infected by one criminal offense, and then they are recovered, get susceptible again, and they may be infected by another serotype. In other words, they may be convinced to get into a career by another kind of seriousness of crime, by persons who have been convicted by the second time and the other way around. And we have this parameter phi, which is the probability of getting a secondary infection, here, 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 and here. For this dengue, we can analyze the dynamics of this model, but the equilibrium analysis is very difficult to carry on. What is interesting when we analyze the dynamic of this model, and this is the model, the complete model for it. These are the Lyapunov exponent, and you see that for a lot of values of the phi, probability of getting infected by another serotype is positive, which means that we have a chaotic dynamics. And this is also bad news for trying to control criminal career. If this is true, if indeed people get convicted by the second time, are normally convicted by more serious crime than in the first one, the system has a chaotic dynamic, so it's unpredictable. But then we simplify the model, and we divide people in two types of criminal behavior. One is less serious, and one that is more serious. So people may be convicted by the less serious crime, may infect susceptible individuals. They may be convicted, and they may be released and get susceptible again, but they may be infected by individuals of a more serious crime. And we have the same notation for the parameter, which expresses the probability of being infected by another kind of criminal behavior. And when we started, has a much more complex equilibrium analysis. And these are the parameters and the variables. This is the model itself. And we see that we can identify equilibrium points for these, for the trivial equilibrium and the non-trivial with any one of those possibilities, okay? And this is the worst of all. It's non-trivial equilibrium in which we have all kinds of categories considered at equilibrium. And the dynamics is tremendously variable. Even when we identify the reproductive number less than 1, we have two unstable equilibrium, depending, of course, on the values of the number, the rate of contacts on that, okay? We are still studying that, but it seems that we have a half bifurcation. Okay, it departs from a stable equilibrium to a cyclic behavior. Okay, this, when we vary, we see this one single unstable equilibrium with this value. This is numerical simulation, of course. And this we see that it gets into a periodical cycle. This is above unit. Reproductive number is above unit, okay? And we have one cycle. You see this phase space, one cyclic equilibrium, which is unstable again. And we have two kind of cycle depending on the initial conditions. These four are not greater than 1. Again, varying the values of the parameters. And we see that these, in the proportion of convicted by the less serious crime stabilizes over time. And finally, one thing that we started to consider is a more complex model in which we consider what we call the carrier pigeons or mosquitoes. What is this? And we know that people inside the prison system influence people outside of that. And the most serious problem with criminality in Brazil, in Rio in particular, is there's these people from the PCC, the command, or the red command inside, organized crime, send orders for people outside, not only infecting people to get into criminal career, but to engage in criminal behavior. And this is done essentially by two ways. One is mobile phones. People are trying to control that, but it's very difficult. But another aspect is people who visit individuals inside the prison. And you have a high rate of people who visit the prisoner, get instructions, and go outside, leave an instruction on that. So we are going to try to apply, they are called carrier pigeons, but we can apply a vector-borne disease as a metaphor, in the sense that you have the visitor is a kind of mosquito who bites one individual and takes this infection, instruction, outside. And then we hope that we can estimate things like the reproductive number. Here is the biting rate. This is the probability that one individual, once bitten, get the infection or the information, and the other way around. And we have, this is mortality, the period of time individuals are inside the prison sending instruction to that. There is a time delay for the instruction to arrive outside, and the factors that remove people from these infective conditions, in a sense. As I mentioned, this is all work in progress. As I mentioned, there is no data involved with that. It's only theoretical work. But what we are trying to do is to get an idea of the structure of the dynamics of criminal organized crime in Brazil. And so if we deep dig in the psychology of individuals, susceptible and criminal convicted individuals, perhaps we can have a glimpse of what can be done to control this, is what is a more serious type of crime than the normal street crimes that we have around here outside the prison system. And that's it. I'm very economic in time. You have a lot of time to take coffee and so on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. So, well, this is a fantastic talk. It's an important subject, and we certainly have lots of questions. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. Yes, Jorge.
Yeah, certainly interesting talk. It's you're going into the psychological behavior of the potential criminal. My question is, a potential criminal can be affected by the environment. So in which of your formulas you've considered a kind of environmental thing affecting one potential individual?
Thank you for your question. It's exactly this term here.
Epsilon?
Yes. These are environmental factors that influence people to get into. But also, as I mentioned, these are intrinsic factors, but these are environmental factors, in a sense. In addition to unknown factors that we don't know, we have some ideas. These are all environmental factors. You see, use, drug, unemployment, economic factors, social, economic.
Right. That's fine. But then, so let's assume, for example, educational level, right?
Right.
Or socioeconomic factors. So the way this epsilon intervenes into the model is like kind of, it depends on time, it depends on space?
Yes, absolutely yes. You have this varying a long time, and it varies from place to place. These are the so-called social deterministic of criminality. And there is much attention focused on these factors here in Brazil. And there are some people who even say that that's all. All we need to do is to improve the socioeconomic environment and you're going to reduce criminality. Okay? We know that is not entirely true. We have people who independent on the environment, like psychopaths. You have also one important factor, perhaps the most important factors of all, in determining, apart from psychopathy, you see the prenatal history. We carry out a study seeing what would be the determinants of people abandoning school. And the most important variable related to the probability of leaving the school system is stress of the mother. Okay? So I used to say that prenatal is the most important period of our life. I always like to say that the oven is more important than the recipe.
Yes. Have you tested this thing with data, with real data?
Yes, this one, yes. But not to criminality, but to living in school system, abandoning school, which is, a precondition, almost a precondition to get into a criminal career.
Thank you.
So, Eduardo, thanks for this very nice talk. You said you have no tried anything with data, but at the end you have to estimate something. What kind of estimation do you think that's possible to do with these models? I suppose you want to apply to some data set. Do you think, what should be your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. You know better than me that one of the purposes of modeling is to go ahead of data. A good structure based on reality model can guide which are the parameters that should be studied. This is exactly what I'm proposing in here. If we manage to study each one of these, we can see what is the risk of one individual to get into a criminal career. Although it's very difficult to intervene for one single individual, you can intervene in a population. Okay? So it's important to know these factors, quantify each one of these factors in a given specific community. So you may improve the prenatal history of that specific community. You're going to reduce susceptibility to criminal career. And on the other hand, if you can intervene in each one of these, and these are the parameters that must be known empirically, okay? So the model is ahead of empirical data. It should be a kind of guiding of field work. Go there and study what is the intensity of drug use and employment, peer influence, and so on.
Okay, so a second question related to that somehow. I mean, when you consider, say, two strain models, let's basically say, you already have a very complex dynamics, but then you can iterate on that and can generate more and more complex dynamics. So one of the questions I was also interested in the kind of Zenger model is how much complex a model needs to be
useful.
Sort of.
Yeah, I wouldn't say complex, but how complete a model should be in order to be useful. Of course, the closest to the reality, most difficult to analyze a model, you know that. And then that's why we're trying to simplify and the simplest model as possible. It's very reductionist approach. So, but you have to consider all the things that are important, right? So if you manage to find what's important in a theoretical framework like this, and if you design a model that is simple enough to be analyzed quantitatively, but still be useful to make predictions. So that's the art of modeling.
But if in the class of your models, I mean, how many types of convictions you would be willing to
It's
consider?
very much dependent on the reality. I mean that I heard, but I'm not sure about that on average in Brazil, people are convicted 2 times. Okay? I'm not sure on that figure. Okay. I just heard about that. But this is possible to know. You go to the judicial system and you see. So you can determine how many individuals, how many convictions on average. And if you can take uncertainty on that, okay? What's the variance of this distribution? And then you can incorporate step by step that into the model. So I mean, in other words, a model with 2 conviction cycles is enough to understand a huge proportion of the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, let's see if there is any other question. Well, I do have a comment and a question. I wanted to emphasize that since we are trying to connect the different talks, one dream that I have is perhaps put some stochasticity in your model and see how that would affect the dynamics, as well as perhaps try to connect with time patterns and hopefully even with geographical patterns. So have you tried to put stochasticity in the models, and how would that affect the results?
Yeah. The answer is not yet. Why? We are dealing, our attempt is to understand the basic structure of a criminal career. That's why we are dealing with only deterministic approach yet. As we don't have data yet, we just want to understand what is the basic dynamics of the phenomenon, right? That's why we use mean field theory. Imagine that we have a huge number of individuals involved. But of course, stochasticity is central when we start to dealing with real data. When empirical data is going to arrive, if we manage to guide some empirical and field works with the model, then stochasticity would be central to that. We have seen that in the previous talk on that. Shouldn't be that difficult, but the basic framework and the structure would be essentially the same.
That's very good news from the mathematical point of view, because there's lots of mathematical work to be done.
Oh, yeah.
With that note, perhaps we should stop here and thank Professor Eduardo
very
Massad
much.
once more. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Eduardo, for being
Okay.
here. We